Welcome to Dialogue this week. In this corner, we invite guests from in and out of Korea to talk about a wide variety of issues ranging from culture and sports to the latest trends around the world. Now, like we all know, South Korea elected its new leader to run the country from this May, namely the People Power Party's Yoon Suk-yeol. Yoon will have a lot on his plate as he comes into office, ranging from politics and diplomacy to the economy. But one of the things Yoon highlighted was support for the nation's culture sector. Today, we touch upon 7 pledges Yoon made that focuses on supporting artists in blind spots, shaking up the welfare system, and establishing cultural sovereignty. For this, we're joined by Kim Hoo-ran, senior culture reporter at Korea Herald, and our go-to film critic, Jason Bejervaise, both via Skype. Welcome to the show.
Good morning.
Now, first, let's start with Hoo-ran. While there's hope for the culture and arts sector with the pledges made by the president-elect, there are also concerns that the new administration may be more focused on issues like recovery from COVID-19, trade, or the housing market, and this would push cultural issues into the backseat. And you've watched the culture industry through many administration changes. What usually happens, and how do you expect the incoming Yoon administration to prioritize his cultural pledges?
Okay. So then then candidate Yoon Suk-yeol announced his election pledges concerning the arts and culture sector only barely a month ahead of the election. And as you said, those were 7 points. There were 7 points to these pledges. They include investment in regional arts and culture facilities, greater expanded opportunities for lower income groups to participate in cultural activities, also greater focus on digital technologies in arts and culture education, and as you mentioned, more support, fair and tailor-made support for artists, and expansion of minimum social safety net for artists. Then there was also pledge to support K-culture startups and to preserve traditional culture and heritage, and also creating greater opportunities for artists with disabilities. As I said earlier, these pledges were announced barely a month before the election, and I think that's telling of the incoming administration's priorities. It's not very high up on the agenda at the moment, and understandably so, because there are so many more pressing issues at the moment. Looking back over the years, I recall the Kim Dae-jung administration, which came into office following the devastating Asian financial crisis. It took him a year to actually properly, I guess, pay attention to the culture sector. His administration was the first ever to set the arts and culture budget at 1% of the annual budget. So that was a big thing that he did at the wake of the financial crisis that he had to deal with. So I see similar things happening with the incoming administration. There are, as you mentioned, there's the recovery from the COVID and other pressing international and domestic issues that need to be dealt with. And so I think it might take a bit of time for the new government to pay close attention to the needs and demands of the arts and culture sector.
Right. Now let's bring Jason into the conversation. Jason, you've been a film critic based in Seoul for a decade, and how has an administrative change and consequently changes in policies affected the film industry?
Well, they've had a big impact on the film industry. You just have to look at the blacklist under Lee Myung-bak and back to see the problems that happened, and the relationship between the film industry and the Busan Film Festival rapidly deteriorated after 2014, when they screened the documentary, there was critical of the government response to the Sewol ferry sinking. And many filmmakers were blacklisted, including Lee Chang-dong, who submitted his screenplay to the Korean Film Council and received 0 points for it. The film actually then went on to win Best Screenplay at the Cannes Film Festival. And then during the Moon Jae-in administration, I think there's certainly been a bigger emphasis on trying to support the film industry. And by and large, I think it's been very successful. And we've seen Parasite go on to win Best Picture at the Oscars. We've seen the success of Squid Game. That being said, though, the film industry at the moment, on the one hand, is doing, or certainly the culture industry is performing exceptionally well overseas. Exports hit $11.92 billion dollars in 2020, which was an increase of 16%. And exports overall were actually down. But domestically, though, the film industry is in a crisis. Admissions are significantly down. The local market share was to local films was 30% last year. That's for the first time in over a decade. And so I think that the next government under Yoon Suk-yeol is going to have to find ways to try and support the industry whilst also ensuring that it remains incredibly competitive and successful on the world stage.
Now, speaking of support, Horan, President-elect Yoon also suggested fair support without blind spots for artists. So who are these artists, and has this blind spot gotten worse as a negative side effect of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Okay, so the Culture Ministry's budget for this year has been set at 7.4 trillion won, which is the biggest so far. And it has also pledged to spend 70% of the budget in the first half of the year to help with the COVID-19 recovery for artists and the arts and culture sector. When we talk about artists in the blind spot, these are often artists who are new and emerging, as opposed to more well-known established names. Over the last 2 years, the government did have many support programs, fundings for artists, for which they needed to apply. What happened a lot of times was that these artists were required to prove that they were indeed artists and that they were engaged in making creative works. Now, number one problem was that many of these artists did not know of the existence of these programs. Number two, they had great difficulties providing paperwork to prove that they were indeed artists. So, well, as the government had all these funds available, it's not very clear how much of it actually went to the new and emerging artists who actually would have benefited greatly from such support. On the other hand, I've also heard from the field that many of the well-known, more established names, groups, were even asked to apply for these fundings and had very little problem getting them. So I think that is something that the new incoming government might have to work on to provide greater accessibility, equal access for these fundings and support programs.
Let's hope the distribution problem would get better with the incoming administration. But one of the 7 pledges made by President-elect Yoon was to narrow the cultural gap between regions. So, Horan, how severe do you see this cultural gap to be? And do you think platforms for cultural experiences are indeed centralized for both artists and audiences?
Right. If you traveled outside of Seoul and traveled to even major regional capitals, you would clearly note the gap in the facilities and services that are available. A recent survey showed that out of 270 art museums in the country, 106 were located in Seoul and the capital area. So by not having these facilities, let's say if you're an artist and working in regional areas, you just find it very difficult to find a place to show your work. And therefore, there's a flight of artists to the capital areas. I mean, you need to go where you can actually show. Without a doubt, there is a huge discrepancy in the kind of culture and art services that people in the regional provinces can experience as well. So I think this is something that the Yoon administration can really work on to make it more regionally balanced, let's say.
Mm-hmm. But Jason, are there other areas within the film industry that need more government support considering the president-elect's pledges?
I think certainly the exhibition sector, is where there needs to be a lot of support. I mean, the film industry is going through some rapid changes. There is definitely pivoting towards streaming, and we're seeing that with the major studios in Korea having to really compete with Netflix. So CJ's got its own streaming service being, and the other studios have announced not just films, but series as well. And so the thing is with exhibitors, they rely solely on theatrical. Now, the industry much of it is fully integrated. So CJ and Lotte, they're distributors. They also own their own theaters. And so in a sense, they're very much, I mean, if they're able to successfully pivot towards streaming and also remain focused on theatrical, that's good for them. But certainly, I think the theatrical aspects of the industry certainly need a lot of support going forward. And, the fact that last year 30% of admissions went to Korean films, that's the lowest in 10 years, and that is concerning. And a lot of these films are in holding patterns at the moment, and they have been for 2 years. And so it's trying to find the right time for them to get released and ensure that they do break even. And so I think the focus on the next administration also needs to be on the exhibition sector. Only this week, the screening or the girl responsible for the theatres, they're calling for the government to allow people to be able to eat popcorn in the cinema because they're really struggling. And there's been a lot of support packages in the United States to support the exhibition sector, and I think there are greater calls for that to happen here too.
Let's hope for that too. But Horan, for the rest of the culture and arts sector, mentioned in his pledge is policy change for employment insurance premiums for low-income artists and preparing artists for social crises like the pandemic. So is this what the artists really want? And what do you think those in the industry want with the overlap of a pandemic recovery and a change in administration?
Okay, the pandemic has been an accelerator as well as an exacerbator. It has exacerbated the problem of difficulties faced by artists and the culture sector, and guaranteeing minimal social safety network for artists, I think is an idea that's long overdue and something that needs to be done. And hopefully this pandemic situation will bring about a change in the situation. For every star artist out there, there are hundreds more who struggle to make a living every day. Having said that, I would also like to point out one of the major concerns of the arts and culture sector concerning the incoming administration. It's that it has pledged to provide assistance without interference. Now, this is a key issue for the artists because of the trauma that they suffered with the so-called blacklist of arts and culture figures during the Lee Myung-bak administration, and especially during the Park Geun-hye administration. You'll notice that these were two previous conservative governments. Under the blacklist compiled during the Park Geun-hye administration, there were about 10,000 people who were on the list. And these people were cut off from funding assistance. And in many cases, they did not realize that they had been on this blacklist. The Constitutional Court declared such list unconstitutional. But the issue has not been clearly settled yet. And the Yoon the president-elect's pledge is notable for its lack of any mention of the blacklist. I think at the very least, what the culture and arts sector needs is a pledge that there will be no recurrence of such blacklisting.
Right. We have a lot of more questions prepared, but due to time constraints, I'm afraid we will have to wrap up at this point. Thank you so much for making time for us, Horan and Jason. Let's hope for more developments and support in the culture field over the next 5 years. Thank you again for joining us.
Thank you.
Thank you.